Let me tell you about a summer out on the eastern plains of Colorado, where the land stretches so flat and so far that a boy on a bicycle can look like the only living thing for miles. This was the summer of 2019, in a little farm town called Flagler, in Kit Carson County. And this is the story of a 13-year-old boy named Eli Hartwig, who spent the whole of that summer collecting things his neighbors had thrown behind their barns and forgotten about. Every morning, before the heat rolled in off the shortgrass prairie, Eli would take his bicycle down Highway 36 and turn off onto whichever dirt road came next. He rode a hand-me-down mountain bike his brother had outgrown. The paint faded to the color of old chalk. Behind it, he pulled a small wooden trailer his father had welded to an axle from a broken lawnmower. And in that trailer, day after day, week after week, he brought home the same thing: old aluminum irrigation pipes. Long sections of them, dented, oxidized. Some of them bent at the ends where they'd been dropped off the back of a tractor 20 years earlier. Pipes from the old center pivot systems that farmers around Flagler had upgraded or abandoned back in the 1990s and never bothered to haul away. He knocked on doors. He asked politely. He took off his cap. And farmer after farmer said the same thing. "Sure, son. Take what you want." Then they'd lean on the fence and watch him wrestle those old pipes into his trailer, one at a time, and they'd laugh. Now, I want you to understand, it wasn't a mean laughter. It was the kind of chuckle a grown man gives when he sees something that just doesn't add up. A skinny boy hauling rusted metal in the summer sun. What on earth for? One of them, a fellow named Ronnie Vetch, gave Eli a whole flatbed load for free and told his wife at supper that night, well, at least somebody's finally cleaning up that eyesore behind the machine shed. By the middle of July, Eli Hartwig had more irrigation pipes stacked behind his father's tool shed than some of the working farms in the county. He had it sorted by diameter, he had it counted, and he had not told a single soul what any of it was for. Not his father, Dean, who watched from the porch some evenings and said nothing. Not his mother, Mary Kate, who drove into Burlington 3 days a week to work as a nurse and came home too tired to ask. Not his older brother, Brody, who was 16 and interested in trucks and football, and whether a girl named Tessa would look at him at the county fair. Not his little sister, Hannah, who was 9 and followed him everywhere and handed him tools he hadn't asked for. And not the neighbors. The neighbors, most of all, had no idea what was coming. Now here's what you need to understand about that stretch of eastern Colorado. It's high plains country, dry. The soil is sandy and thin over hard pan. Real farmers out there don't grow crops, they extract them, one pumped gallon of water at a time, out of a thing called the Ogallala Aquifer. It sits deep underground, thousands of years old, and it's been holding up agriculture across 7 states since before Eli's grandfather was born. But by 2019, everybody in Kit Carson County knew the aquifer was dropping. 3 feet a year, 4 feet in a dry year. The electric bills to pump that water up kept climbing, and the water table kept sinking. And every farmer along Highway 36 had learned to live with a quiet dread they didn't much talk about at church. Eli's father, Dean Hartwig, farmed 320 acres of winter wheat and grain sorghum. He was a second-generation farmer, a quiet man with big, weathered hands and a habit of standing in a doorway with a coffee cup, looking out at his fields like he was trying to remember something. In June of that year, he got an electric bill for $620, just for pumping water. He set it on the kitchen table and didn't say a word about it. But Eli saw the paper. Eli saw everything. And here's the thing about Eli Hartwig. He wasn't a talker. He wasn't the smartest kid in his class. He didn't win any prizes. What he had, and what most people around him hadn't learned to notice yet, was patience. The kind of patience that a certain kind of child is just born with. He would sit on the north edge of the south field for hours and watch how the wind moved the dust. He would watch which rows of sorghum wilted first in the afternoon. He would watch how the old windmill on the far corner of the property, the one his father had disconnected back in 1998 when the electric well went in, still turned in the evening breeze, slow and steady, over a shallow spring that had never once dried up. He watched the water. And more than that, he watched where the water was and where it wasn't. That summer, the county extension agent, a good-natured man named Ray Sandoval, came out twice to Dean Hartwig's place to look at the sorghum. Ray drove a white pickup with the Colorado State Extension logo on the door, and he had the sort of steady, careful manner of a man who's given a lot of bad news to a lot of good people. He walked the rows with Dean, and he told him what he'd told half the county already. Drill deeper, pump harder. Consider drought-tolerant hybrid varieties for next season. Eli stood there listening, not saying anything, just listening. When Ray got back in his truck, Eli walked up to the window and asked him a question. A quiet question, in the way a boy asks a question when he already knows most of the answer and just needs one small piece confirmed. "Mr. Sandoval," he said, "if the water table keeps dropping like that, is there gonna come a year when the pumping just doesn't pay anymore?" Ray Sandoval looked at that 13-year-old boy for a long moment. Then he said, "Son, that year's already come for some folks." He put his truck in gear and drove away. Eli walked back into the tool shed. He looked at his stacks of old aluminum pipe. And that evening, he went into his great-aunt Idela's trailer, which sat parked in a stand of Russian olive trees just north of the farmhouse. He sat down at her little kitchen table, and he asked her to show him her boxes again. Grain sorghum, sometimes called milo, is one of the most drought-tolerant grain crops grown in the American high plains. Its deep, fibrous root system can reach moisture that corn cannot, and it uses roughly 1/3 less water than corn to produce a comparable yield. Across the Ogallala Aquifer region, farmers have increasingly turned to sorghum as groundwater levels decline, though the transition requires new equipment, new markets, and a patience for smaller margins that not every operation can afford. Part 2. Now here's the part you have to understand, because none of what followed makes sense without it. Eli Hartwig had a great aunt. Her name was Eli Hartwig, and she was 79 years old the summer this story takes place. She lived alone in a single wide trailer parked just north of the main farmhouse. In the shade of 3 old Russian olive trees her husband had planted the year Kennedy was shot. She kept the trailer neat as a pin. She drank her coffee black. She wore a faded denim work shirt every day of the week except Sunday. And on the shelves that ran along both walls of her narrow living room, she kept 41 cardboard boxes full of agricultural bulletins, extension pamphlets, mimeographed research notes, and one thick unpublished manuscript that had belonged to her husband, Wade Hartwig, who had died of a heart attack in 1989. Wade had been an irrigation engineer for the Colorado State Extension Service. He'd spent 30 years driving the back roads of the Eastern Plains, working with farmers on soil moisture, subsurface drainage, low-pressure delivery systems. He'd been especially interested in something most of his colleagues thought was a dead end: subsurface gravity-fed irrigation for sandy soils. The idea was simple. Instead of spraying water into the air with pivots and letting half of it evaporate before it hit the ground, you'd bury perforated pipes 8 inches down in the root zone and let low-pressure water seep out slowly, right where the plants needed it. Wade had written a whole manuscript on it in 1978. He'd argued the design would use 40 to 50% less water than surface irrigation. He'd sent it to 3 agricultural journals. All 3 had turned it down. Cheap diesel and cheap electricity were going to solve everything, they said. Nobody needed to think about subsurface anything. Wade had put the manuscript in a green cardboard box, and Adela had kept that box on the top shelf of her closet ever since he died. Now, Eli had been coming into his great-aunt's trailer since he was old enough to walk. Adela had put seeds in his hands when he was 4. She'd taught him the names of every native grass on the property by the time he was 7. She'd shown him her boxes when he was 10, not making anything of it, just letting him look. And she was the first person, long before anyone else, to notice that Eli was watching the world in a way most children don't. Other kids watched the crops. Eli watched the water. He watched where it went, where it pooled, where the soil cracked first in a dry spell, where the shadow of the elevator on the west side of the property kept the ground cool an extra hour every morning, where the old windmill kept spinning over a spring nobody had bothered with in 20 years. Adela noticed all of it, and she waited. She was patient too. That was a thing they shared without ever needing to say so. That summer, in the middle of July, when Eli walked into her trailer and asked to see her boxes again, Adela knew something had shifted. She poured him a glass of iced tea. She pulled down the green box from the top shelf, and she set Wade's manuscript in front of him on the little formica table. Eli opened it that night. He didn't understand all of it, not the first time through. There were equations. There were diagrams of pipe networks with arrows showing pressure gradients. There were tables of soil types cross-referenced with recommended pipe diameters and burial depths. But at the front of the manuscript, in Wade Hartwig's own handwriting, there was a single paragraph that Eli understood perfectly. It said this: "The water in this region does not need to be pumped harder. It needs to be delivered better. Every farmer on the Eastern Plains is fighting gravity when he could be using it. Eli read that sentence 4 times. Then he sat back in his chair and looked out the little window of the trailer past the Russian olives, out toward the north corner of his father's property where the old windmill stood. The windmill, the spring, the 11-foot rise between the north corner and the southern edge of the sorghum field. The old concrete stock tank his grandfather had built in 1956, now full of dead leaves and cracked along the north side, but still holding the shape of a tank. The stacks of aluminum pipe behind the tool shed, waiting. He saw the whole thing in one moment. The way a boy his age sees something clearly only when he's been staring at the pieces long enough for them to fit together on their own. He didn't say anything to his great aunt. He just closed the manuscript. He kissed her on the cheek. And he walked out into the summer dusk. That week, Ray Sandoval came back one more time. He'd heard from Dean about how Eli had been asking questions and hauling pipe. And he came out partly to check on the sorghum, and partly, if he was honest, to see if the boy was up to something worth watching. He and Dean stood at the edge of the south field. Eli was down at the far end, on his knees, measuring something with a steel tape. Ray watched him for a while. Then he said, "Dean, what's your boy building over there?" Dean shrugged in that quiet way of his and said, "I don't rightly know, Ray. I asked him once. He said he'd show me when it was ready, so I quit asking." Ray nodded. He didn't press it. But before he left, he walked down the field and stood next to Eli for a minute. He looked at the pipes stacked along the ditch. He looked at the trench Eli had already scratched into the soil with a hand tool. He looked at the old windmill turning slowly in the distance. And he said, "Son, I don't know exactly what you're doing here, but I'll tell you this. Nobody has tried anything new around here in a long time. You keep at it." Eli looked up. He nodded once. Ray got back in his truck, and Eli went back to measuring. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of graph paper. He drew a line from the windmill to the concrete tank. He measured the drop, 11 feet. He drew the pipe network. He calculated the pressure. He wrote down the diameters he needed at each junction. And when his mother came in from her shift at the clinic, tired and quiet, she saw her son bent over the paper, working with the kind of focus she'd only ever seen in men twice his age. She didn't ask what he was doing. She just kissed the top of his head and went to make supper. The Ogallala Aquifer underlies 8 states from South Dakota to Texas and supports roughly 30% of all irrigated agriculture in the United States. Since large-scale pumping began in the 1940s, water levels have declined by more than 100 feet in parts of Kansas, Texas, and eastern Colorado. Hydrologists estimate that in some counties, at current extraction rates, economical pumping may become impossible within the next 2 to 3 decades. Subsurface irrigation and dryland farming techniques are being studied more seriously now than at any point since the 1970s. Part 3. Now here's where the story turns, and I want you to picture it clearly, because this is the part that matters. The last week of July, Eli Hartwig started digging. He dug alone at first. He used a pickaxe, a flat spade, and a small hand tool his great-aunt Adela called a sod knife. He worked in the early mornings before the sun cleared the grain elevator, and again in the evenings after the heat broke. The trenches ran along the contour of the south field, angled just slightly downhill from the concrete tank at the north corner. 8 inches deep, 18 inches wide, straight as a plumb line for 80 yards. His father watched from the porch the first Saturday. He didn't say anything. He drank his coffee. He watched his boy dig. And then, without a word, he went to the shed, got another spade, walked out to the field, and started digging alongside him. They dug for 4 hours. When they stopped, Dean said, "You gonna tell me what this is?" Eli said, "When it works, Daddy." Dean nodded and drank from his water jug and said, "All right then." That was the entirety of the conversation. Now, the old windmill up on the north corner had been shut off since 1998. The vanes were rusted. The gearbox was dry. The pump rod had bent slightly in a hailstorm around 2006, and nobody had ever climbed up to check on it. It sat over a shallow spring that fed a natural seep the family had used, back in Eli's great-grandfather's day, to water cattle. The spring had never run dry. Not in the drought of the 50s, not in the drought of 2012, and not in the current dry stretch either. It just kept giving what it gave, quiet and constant, a few gallons a minute out of the ground. Eli couldn't fix the windmill himself, but there was an old German neighbor named Gus Kruger, 81 years old, who lived a mile east down the section road. Gus had immigrated with his parents in 1949, and he'd known Wade Hartwig personally back in the 70s. Wade had helped him lay a drainage line for a low spot on his hay meadow, and Gus had never forgotten it. When Eli rode over on his bicycle and asked in his quiet way if Mr. Kruger might help him get an old windmill turning again, Gus set down his coffee cup, put on his hat, and said, "Boy, I've been waiting 40 years for somebody to ask me that." They worked on it together for 6 days. Gus taught Eli how to grease the gearbox, how to true the vanes, how to check the leathers on the pump cylinder down in the well casing. On the 6th evening, the wind picked up out of the southwest, and the vanes caught, and the pump rod stroked once, twice, 3 times, and clear cold water came up out of the pipe and ran into the old concrete tank for the first time in 21 years. Gus took off his hat. He stood there looking at the water. Then he looked at Eli, and he said, "Well, I'll be damned, son. You just brought your granddad's windmill back to life." Eli didn't smile. He just nodded once and started calculating how long it would take the tank to fill. The first attempt at the pipe network failed. It failed badly. Eli had laid the main line the way he understood it from Wade's manuscript, but he hadn't accounted for the fact that eastern Colorado soil is heavy with fine sand, and that sand migrates into perforated pipes through any opening larger than about a millimeter. Within 3 days, the whole system was clogged. Water backed up in the main line. Nothing reached the far end of the field. Eli dug up a section and looked at it. The pipes were full of wet sand. He went back to the manuscript. He read the section on filtration 3 times, and he saw what he'd missed. Wade had specified a gravel envelope around every perforated section, a bed of clean pea gravel 3 inches thick, wrapped in a coarse fabric mesh. It kept the sand out. It let the water through. Eli spent his egg money savings on 8 bags of pea gravel from the feed store in Burlington. He spent his own last $22 on a roll of landscape fabric. He and Hannah, his little sister, hauled every bag out to the field in the wooden trailer. Hannah, 9 years old and small for her age, insisted on carrying the fabric roll herself. She dropped it twice. She didn't complain. They rebuilt the whole thing over 3 long days. Eli laid the gravel envelope around every perforated joint, wrapped the fabric careful and tight, refit every connection with plumber's tape and a wrench Gus Kruger had loaned him. The second attempt worked, but barely. The pressure at the far end of the field was too low. The last 20 yards of the run were bone dry, while the first section was oversaturated. Eli lay flat in the dirt at the end of the line, felt the soil above the pipe, and knew immediately what was wrong. The pipe diameter tapered wrong. He'd stepped it down too soon. He went back to Wade's manuscript one more time. He read the flow rate tables. He understood finally that pressure equalizes across a run only when the main line is wider than the branch lines, and that he'd reversed that principle without meaning to. He traded pipe sections with Gus for 2 whole afternoons, moving the larger diameter forward and the smaller diameter back. The third attempt held. The water moved silent and slow through the subsurface network, seeping out at just the rate Wade had calculated in 1978. No pump, no electricity, no noise, just gravity, and 11 feet of drop, and a windmill turning steady over a spring that had never quit. Eli didn't tell anyone. He just watched. He watched for 2 weeks. And then one evening, in the second week of August, Dean Hartwig walked out to check the south field. He walked the rows the way he always did. But halfway down the first row, he stopped. He knelt. He put his hand on the soil. The soil was cool. It was dark. It was moist 8 inches down, in the driest August on record. He walked the whole field slowly. Then he walked back to the house. He stood in the kitchen for a long time without saying anything. Mary Kate looked up from the counter. Dean said, "Mary, come look at what our boy did." Subsurface drip irrigation, sometimes abbreviated SDI, delivers water directly to the root zone through buried perforated tubing. Studies from Kansas State University and Colorado State University have shown that well-designed subsurface systems can reduce water consumption by 30 to 50% compared with center pivot sprinklers, while producing comparable or better yields in sorghum, wheat, and cotton. The main obstacles to broader adoption have been the initial installation cost and the technical knowledge required to properly design a system for local soil and slope conditions. Part 4. Now let me tell you how the rest of that summer went. Because the story doesn't end with Dean Hartwig standing in his kitchen. That was only the middle of it. Word travels slow out on the eastern plains, but it travels. The first person Dean told was his brother-in-law over in Cheyenne Wells. That man told the fellow he bought seed from. That fellow told the county extension office. And on the last Friday of August, Ray Sandoval drove out to the Hartwig place in his white pickup. And this time he brought a soil scientist from Colorado State University with him, a woman named Dr. Priscilla Earhart. She'd driven 3 hours from Fort Collins. They walked the south field with Eli. Dr. Earhart asked him questions for 2 straight hours. She kept a small notebook in her hand, and she wrote in it constantly. She asked about the pipe diameters. She asked about the gravel envelopes. She asked about the head pressure at the tank. She asked about the spring flow rate. Eli answered each question the way he did everything, quietly and precisely, and when he didn't know something, he said so plainly. At one point, Dr. Earhart turned to Ray Sandoval and said, "Ray, this is a functioning subsurface gravity-fed system running on a windmill. In 2019, built by a child from salvaged materials." Ray said, "I know, Priscilla." Then Dr. Earhart asked Eli where he'd learned about the design. Eli walked her up to Great Aunt Idela's trailer. Idela made a fresh pot of coffee. She pulled down the green cardboard box. She set Wade Hartwig's 1978 manuscript on the little formica table. Dr. Earhart read it standing up. She read it for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. She said, "This is beautiful work. This should have been published." Idela just smiled her small, dry smile and said, "Ma'am, my husband knew that. So did I." A reporter from the High Plains Journal came out the following week and ran a story with a photograph of Eli standing beside the old windmill. The headline called him a young innovator. Eli thought the phrase was ridiculous and would not look at the paper for 3 days. But here's what really mattered. That second week of September, the neighbors started coming. The same men who had watched Eli haul rusted pipe out of their weed patches all summer. Ronnie Vetch came first. He drove up in his diesel pickup, got out, tipped his hat to Dean, and said he wanted to see this thing everyone was talking about. Dean walked him down to the south field. He didn't say anything. He let Ronnie see it for himself. The sorghum on the south field stood 4 feet tall, dark green, heavy-headed. On the fields next door, sorghum of the same variety planted the same week stood pale and short, the leaves curling from heat stress, the heads light and thin. Ronnie walked 20 yards into the field. He pulled one stalk. He split it open with his pocket knife. The stem was full of moisture. The pith was firm and pale green. Ronnie Vetch stood there for a long time looking at that stalk. Then he looked back at the house. Eli was standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets. Ronnie walked back up. He took off his hat. He said, "Son, I gave you those pipes for nothing. I laughed about it. I told my wife you were cleaning up my mess." And Eli looked up at him and said, "Yes, sir, I remember." Ronnie nodded slow. He said, "Well, I owe you something. Not for the pipes, for the laughing." Eli shook his head. He said, "Mr. Vetch, you don't owe me anything. But if you want, I'll help you lay one before spring." 6 more farmers came over the next 2 weeks. Every one of them stood in the field. Every one of them split a stalk. Every one of them was quiet in a way those men are almost never quiet. And every one of them asked, one way or another, if Eli would help them do the same. He said yes to everyone. He said, "Mr. Kruger and I can start in October, if the weather holds." Now here's the part I want to leave you with, because the harvest, in the end, was not the sorghum. The harvest was quieter than that. On the last Sunday of September, Eli Hartwig came in from checking the windmill at dusk. He walked into his Great Aunt Idela's trailer. She was sitting at the little formica table with her cup of black coffee. Wade's manuscript was open in front of her. She had a pencil in her hand, and she was making a small note in the margin. She looked up when Eli came in. She said, "Eli, your great-uncle used to say that knowledge doesn't die. It just waits for somebody willing to listen." She tapped the manuscript with her pencil. She said, "Wade waited 41 years. He didn't mind waiting. He knew somebody would come." Eli sat down across from her. He looked at the manuscript. The pages were soft at the corners now from being handled all summer. Idela's careful pencil marks ran along the margins. On the top page, in Wade Hartwig's own handwriting from 1978, the sentence still sat where it had always been. "The water in this region does not need to be pumped harder. It needs to be delivered better." Eli reached out. He closed the manuscript gently. He put his hand flat on top of the green cardboard box. And he sat that way, quiet, for a long time. Outside, the wind turned. The old windmill on the north corner caught it and started up again, slow and patient, the way it had for the last 2 months. Water lifted out of the ground the way water has always lifted, without noise, without cost, without asking to be noticed. And somewhere down in the dark soil of the south field, 8 inches beneath the surface, it moved out toward the roots of things that were still growing. That was the harvest. The story of practical agricultural knowledge is often a story of ideas rediscovered rather than newly invented. Windmill-driven groundwater lifting sustained high plains farming from the 1880s until rural electrification in the 1930s and 40s. And low-pressure subsurface irrigation was studied by extension services throughout the 1970s. Much of that early research was set aside when energy prices stayed low. As aquifer levels decline across the region, agricultural engineers are now revisiting those older methods and finding that the fundamentals still work exactly as their original designers described.